Who were Adam and Eve? Were they literal historical figures who gave rise to all of humanity as we know it today? Can every human being on the planet trace their ancestry back to just two people? Or were Adam and Eve non-historical figures, just sort of literary characters that were used by the author to create and to generate larger theological truths to help our understanding about who we are as human beings and how we relate to God? Well, these are very good questions, and we need to take a closer look at them. So we're going to talk about them today on the Science and Faith podcast. The question of the existence of Adam and Eve is one that goes back literally centuries in our history books. People have been discussing, talking about, debating the nature and historicity of Adam and Eve for as long as there's been theology. If we even go back to the very New Testament, 2,000 years ago when Paul wrote it, his understanding of Adam even seems to be very literal and historical. So what are the different positions that within Christian theology that are believed about Adam and Eve? Well, the first view is the literal historical view. This view sees Adam and Eve as literal historical people, not just because it's theologically necessary, which in this view it is, but because that, they would argue, seems to be the historical perspective from church history, that throughout the ages, the church has taught that Adam and Eve were literal historical people. So beyond the historical narrative, though, there is a theological component to the necessity for Adam and Eve to be literal historical people. John Collins is a theologian, and he argues for an historical Adam on the basis that without a historical Adam, there are certain other theological truths that cannot be true. He says this: some people like to say Genesis 1 to 11 aims to tell us not history or science, but theology. They are trying to say something worth saying about Genesis 1 to 11, but they are indulging in a problematic disjunction. The theology is not separable from the story, as we can see from the fact that one of those theological truths is that the one who created the world is the good God who revealed himself to Israel, and not the capricious gods of the other peoples, a historical assertion. And so for John Collins, as he argues about the historicity of Adam and Eve, what he says is we can't simply say, oh, Adam and Eve were not historical people, but they're given to simply tell us theological truth. Well, if you do that, you're separating the theological truth from the historical truth, the historical setting in which that truth takes place, so to speak. And so for John Collins, what he wants to argue is that both the history and the theology are true. And in order for the theology to be true, the history of the theology has to be true as well. He goes on to talk more about this, and he says that a historically true Adam, it enables us to make sense of the world, the components of a good creation marred by the fall. Redemption is God's ongoing work to restore the creatures and the creation. It gives the consummation in which the restoration will be complete and confirmed. This is our basis for understanding the world. So if we don't have the history of Adam and Eve, then we don't get the theological truth of Adam and Eve. If Adam and Eve are not real people, then Jesus coming and dying on the cross for our sins to redeem creation is not theologically true as well. And Collins would argue, that you can't say that Jesus dying on the cross and rising again after 3 days is theologically true because it's theologically necessary for redemption, but historically it never happened. He would say that if historically it's necessary that Jesus actually physically died on the cross and rose again after 3 days, then it is actually historically necessary for Adam to have lived and have been created by God, and for him to have fallen, there to be a literal fall, as described in Genesis 3. Otherwise, if that's not historically true, then why should we say that Jesus is coming and life and ministry and death and resurrection and ascension in heaven is historically true? It can't just simply be theologically true. However, there are others who hold that this perspective on Adam is a non-historical perspective. The most noted person to take the non-historical perspective and who has argued for it is Peter Enns. Peter Enns has argued that Adam is not a historical person, but rather he's known as kind of a figure that has been used as a literary feature to describe humanity. And so in M's view, and he's joined by Dennis Lamoureux, who also argues for a non-historical Adam. So what Enns is arguing is that if Adam is indeed the cause of sin and death in the world, which is the traditional interpretation of what Paul's saying, then the Old Testament writers would have emphasized this. And so he says that given Israel's tendency to disobey God, there would have been ample opportunity for the Old Testament writers to point back to Adam and to say, hey, remember what Adam did? Don't be like him. Hey, this path you're going down, this is something that you need to not do because of your ancestor Adam. There would be this pointing back to Adam as a historical figure within the past, or in the Old Testament sense, the recent past, of Adam. And what we find in the Old Testament is a shocking absence. It's almost as if as soon as Adam falls, and in Genesis 3, he evaporates from the pages of the Old Testament. We don't see him. He's never mentioned. I think there's one reference in Hosea to the covenant of Adam, but by and large, it's as if Adam as a person has completely evaporated from the pages of the Old Testament, which seems odd, given the Old Testament authors would have pointed to him in some fashion or referenced him. It isn't until the New Testament that we get this picture of Adam referenced in relation to Christ. And so some object that the Apostle Paul's extensive knowledge of the Old Testament would surely have informed his understanding of the function of Adam, because Paul was a Pharisee and well-schooled. And for Paul to connect Adam as the spiritual father of the entire human race and cause the introduction of sin and death into the world, that Paul's perspective adds some hermeneutical weight to interpreting Adam as a literal historical person. While that's a reasonable argument to make, Enns would point out that Paul's interpretation of Adam is not determinative of the original meaning, and that Paul is simply offering a hermeneutical perspective, not the hermeneutical perspective, but he's offering a hermeneutical perspective and understanding of Paul's role in the theology of salvation and redemption. Also, he would say that Paul's interpretation of Adam is not really simple and not terribly straightforward. It's very complex, it's very complicated, and it is very nuanced. And the way he references things in Romans 5 isn't particularly clear. It seems like it's about to be clear, and it seems like that he's kind of making this one-to-one correlation between the old Adam and the new Adam, but then he makes some statements like, in Adam all die, so in Christ some shall be saved. So, of course, that's a paraphrase. It's not a direct quote. But there seems to be this one-to-one correlation, but then there isn't this one-to-one correlation. So what Paul is doing there isn't so simple as making an argument for the historicity of the literal existence of Adam. It's far more theologically complicated than that. And so Paul's view of universal and inescapable human alienation from God is completely true. However, it goes beyond what is articulated in Genesis and the theology of the Old Testament writers. And so Paul's view, while helpful and lending a perspective, it is not the determinative for how we view and look at Adam. And so Enns views Adam more in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. He sees the tradition of Adam and Eve is a story about wisdom. It's a story about wisdom coming and needing to come, where Adam and Eve are told not to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so what is knowledge of good and evil? That's wisdom. That's what wisdom is. It's the ability to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. And so it's a narrative story about wisdom. It's not literally the story of Adam and Eve is not a story about Adam and Eve. It's a story about Israel and their need to distinguish and to trust, rely on God for discerning what is right and wrong, and not discerning what is right and wrong in their own eyes. And of course, which is a major theme in the book of Judges, where every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so for Enns, he would argue that the story of Adam and Eve is a story about wisdom. It's not a It's not meant as a historical narrative to see Adam and Eve as literal historical people that did this. Rather, it's a story, it's an example for Israel that sees it as an embodiment of wisdom. Israel needing to keep coming back to God for their determining what is right and what is wrong, for what is good, and for worshiping God, and not turning away and serving other gods or worshiping others. And so that's N's view, essentially. Now, I think the question that at this point we need to raise is then what do we do with 1 Corinthians 15? Wasn't Paul's view of Adam in 1 Corinthians 15 that Adam was a historical person? And Enns talks about this as well. And his view is that Paul's view of Adam was, in fact, a historical person. Paul viewed Adam as a historical person. Enns would acknowledge that. And in fact, he does acknowledge that in his book, The Evolution of Adam. So for Enns, he says, yes, Paul did view Adam as a historical figure, but he's looking at it from the standpoint of a first century Pharisee. And in the first century, for Paul to view Adam as a historical person would have been completely normal. That would have been a completely normal thing to do. But that doesn't mean that Adam actually was a literal historical person. When you actually sit down and you look at Paul's theology and you look at what does Paul say is essential to the gospel to believe, Enns would say that what's essential for the gospel is the universal and self-evident problem of death, the universal and self-evident problem of sin, and the historical event of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is what is essential to the gospel. It's not essential to believe that Adam was or was not a historical person. That can remain somewhat ambiguous, uncertain. A person doesn't need to believe in historical Adam in order to be a Christian, or even to be a consistent one. What is essential in the theology of Paul for his gospel is the universal and self-evident problem of death, sin, and the historicity of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that's a kind of an overview of what the different positions on Adam and Eve are. Really, there's only two, literal or non-literal, historical, non-historical views. So I think the important thing, wherever you land on this issue, and I think it's worth investigating further if you diving into this deeper, you can, I would strongly recommend that you do that. But whichever side of the issue you land on, whether you adopt Adam as a historical person or a non-historical person, I think it's important to remember that we don't look at people who are on the other side as somehow not Christians or less of Christians because they view Adam as a historical or non-historical person. It's not essential. This is a non-essential issue when it comes to the gospel and being a Christian. A person can believe in the historicity of Adam. A person cannot believe in the historicity of Adam. Both people are still believers and followers of Jesus. That's possible. So that's our podcast for today. If you have a question or a comment, you can leave it in the comment section down below, or you can send us an email. My email address is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. You can send us a question, or if you have another perspective that you'd like to share about the historical debate on Adam, you can email us at that email address. Also, check out our website. We have some other resources on there that we can recommend for going a little bit deeper in these conversations. There's also some articles that we post about these topics. Our website address is scienceandfaith.de. Go ahead and head on over there, check out some of the newest articles that we have up available, give them a read, and let us know what you think. So that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next time here on the Science and Faith Podcast.